Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 11th of December 2015. Welcome to UK Column News, just after 1 o'clock. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio is Mike Robinson. We'll be joined by live video link, hopefully with no problems, by David Scott from Northern Exposure. Well, a brief comment on the weather. David tells us that up there in Scotland, where he is at least, there's blue sky. It's a wonderful day. London is apparently a bit dingy. Rhondda is wet, but the corgis in Pembrokeshire are basking in the sunshine as well. So mixed weather across the ununited kingdom. We'll be discussing that a bit more. We think this is due probably to European climate change policy. So different weather for different regions is clearly what's being planned and carried out. Where are we going to start? Let's start on the serious issue of the NHS and the BBC here picking up on the Southern NHS Trust, where they're saying that over 1,000 deaths they're regarding as being suspicious, not properly recorded. And this was pointed out to us in light of the fact that we've been mentioning that it seems that there's a sudden drop in the birth of Down syndrome children. The inference is that there's a policy that these vulnerable children are not suitable for the new world. And many people are talking about the unnatural deaths of relatives in the NHS system, where for the elderly in particular, dehydration seems to be a key factor. None of this being investigated properly. There's a report out. The key findings: the Trust could not demonstrate a comprehensive, systematic approach to learning from deaths. Despite the Trust having comprehensive data on deaths, it failed to use it effectively. Too few deaths amongst those with learning disability and over 65s with mental health problems were investigated, and some cases should have been investigated further. This is very, very dangerous stuff. We have got very vulnerable people dying in the hospitals. The hospitals know something is going on. We're not investigating the deaths. If I just add to that, please, Mike, we just bring in this. At the end of the BBC article was an NHS number, call 0300 003 0025. Well, we did in order to see what we got, thinking that we would have some person of responsibility and concern from the NHS. In fact, there was a very polite and helpful lady from the NHS, but she clearly did not know who was the main person in charge of taking calls. So we're going to say that we had a helpful but vague NHS operator. She suggested someone could call us back, but didn't really know who that would be. When we called NHS England, their media staff seemed quite busy, just said, well, send us an email. Our feeling on this is that the vulnerable are being murdered in the NHS. We are deliberately using that expression. And this is based on the enormous amount of material which is now coming into the UK column, where people are talking about the mysterious deaths of loved ones under strange circumstances. And at that point, we'll just bring David in, if we may. David, this is very, very dangerous.
Indeed it is.
Yeah.
We have an organisation here that we must remember was founded immediately after the Second World War and was founded on openly on Stalinist principles. So this was the big state in all of its glory. This was going to be much more efficient, and the reason it was brought in, or the reason it was given at the time, was the previous health provision, which had been a mixture of private provision, charitable provision, free hospitals, all sorts of and varieties of healthcare, was inefficient. It wasn't that people weren't getting treated; it's that it was inefficient, and the sort of central planning that was going to be the way of the future should be brought into healthcare, and it would save a lot of money, and we would be all better off for it. And of course, it's not worked out that way. We have a situation where the principle is it's free at the point of use. So the price is artificially set to zero, and of course that means that the demand always exceeds supply, as you don't have any rationing by price. So you have rationing by other things, and those other things are largely secret and are often dangerous, be they waiting lists or be they decisions that some people are just too much trouble.
Well, David, yeah, this is very serious, very, very dangerous. Cuts now being blamed for deaths inside the NHS. We think something else is going on as well. You are going to be talking about the Forth Road Bridge a little bit later, where cuts also putting people at risk through safety issues. Well, let's move on to the Mail, which produced a very, very detailed article recently praising the Israeli forces for going into Syria and rescuing terrorists who were then treated to the highest standards both by the military and in civilian hospitals. Now, several people picked up on this report, and they are highly suspicious of it because what is actually going on here, that the Israelis are suddenly turning the Good Samaritan and treating people who, on paper at least, would be out to kill Israeli citizens. Well, we decided to have a look at this a little bit further. We were intrigued by an embedded video footage in this report by the Mail. This is it here. And we decided to take a little look at Jake Willis Simmons, who is the global reporter that's produced this video clip. And if you watch it carefully, at one point you will see flashing into the top right hand corner of that embedded video IDF. So this is an Israeli Defense Force video, and we apparently have a Daily Mail reporter who just happened to be there in order to film the event. Well, we did a little bit of basic research about the gentleman concerned. Here he is, Mr. Simmons. He's an award-winning journalist. He's worked with the Telegraph, the Times, BBC, CNN and other. He's got a PhD in creative writing. We're a little bit concerned about that because creative writing is moving away from facts pretty quickly. But what else did we find about him? Well, he produced this article in the Jewish Chronicle. Essentially, it's about Mr. Corbyn and his friends, but within it was the following text, which we found significant. Opposing Israel has become the dominant totemic cause for left-wingers in recent decades, magnetising the energy that was previously expended on apartheid, South Africa, Irish republicanism and other charismatic causes of yesteryear. It's also become a convenient symbol of the Western imperialism that so irritates the far left. Many of those campaigning against the Jewish state may be acting out of deeply held political and social convictions, even if others would argue passionately against them. But the bloated, disproportionate focus on Israel has taken on a life of its own and become a lightning rod for anti-Semitism. Now, our feeling is that this article shows an extremely strong pro-Israel and Israeli stance by this journalist. He's clearly been given access to very high-level contacts in order to film with alongside Israeli Defense Forces, and the Mail has then packaged this into the public domain without any real context of the true background. David, this stuff is very, very dangerous when stories are injected into the worldwide media system. 1 minute they've been created, the next minute they're fact. What do you make of this story? The Israelis have suddenly turned the other cheek.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, the Israeli view of themselves is very much that they are a country which is a blessing to the nations round about, and they look with some considerable pride on philanthropic enterprises, medical expeditions and such like, and they do have some genuine capability in that area. They have a very advanced Western medical system, and when you have things like earthquakes and India and places like this, you will find there will be Israeli units mobilising to assist. and they view that is quite an important part in Jewish societies, how they view themselves. So in part it's playing into this, but there's a whole heap more going on here, because you have only selected journalists will get to go embedded with the IDF. There will be no criticism of the IDF under those circumstances. So that's absolutely fundamental. Secondly, which side of the border were they on? So we're talking about a border incursion. Now, actually, border incursions in that area into Syria are not at all unusual. In fact, they might even be called routine. But it was a cross-border incursion. And look what happened to a Russian aircraft when it spent 17 seconds in the wrong place. So there's issues there as well about respecting sovereignty. And then, yes, there's the basic contrast that, yes, if you have someone who's injured, you might care for them. But if you're going out to recover fighters who are at least ostensibly opposed to the existence of your country, it does start to pose really significant questions about how much we're actually being told the truth, who's funding who's supporting who, and it goes into this continuing disinformation storm that's coming out of the Syria area.
Yeah, David, thank you for that analysis. Well, whilst all the terrorism business is going on, we might expect our security services to be looking after our best interests, but they've apparently gone Christmas shopping. Mike?
Indeed, BBC reporting here that GCHQ could grab UK shopping data. Well, my reaction to this is surprise, surprise. I mean, we've been talking about this for many, many years. So the BBC reporting here that the draft investigatory powers bill includes plans to store the online activity of everyone in the UK, but a lesser known clause would let the security services download personal details from bulk databases. And this is according to an internet privacy campaigner, Jim Killock, and he's saying that it could even include things like the Tesco Club Card scheme. Now, of course, this is something that we have been saying for many, many years. And the key point here to remember is, at least I believe the key point to remember is, what is the Data Protection Act for? We're told it's there to protect our personal data and make sure that our personal data is not misused. But in the process, there's a big section of the Data Protection Act which requires people to register their data use and their databases. So the Data Protection Act provides for a register, a database of databases, and it has been my view for many, many years that that register is there so that government agencies then have somewhere to go to look for particular types of data as they need it in the future. So this story comes as no surprise because I believe the Data Protection Act was put in place specifically for this purpose.
David?
Yes, well, on the basis that all government acts are in fact named to be the reverse of the true intent, I think the Data Protection Act is no different there. There's a huge amount in the Data Protection Act which is about sharing information, how to share information, and it enables sharing information, and it really provides very little protection, if any at all.
Yeah. Well, Mike, if you must take us on to Mr. Blair.
Yes, so Tony Blair was in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee this morning to talk about Libya. Well, let's see what he looked like. There you go. And it was quite amusing. He was asked, was it your initiative to contact Gaddafi? So they were supposed to be looking into what trade-offs Tony Blair had made to get into bed with Colonel Gaddafi. Did he make any trade-offs over Yvonne Fletcher, Lockerbie, the IRA, and so on? And so he was asked, was it your initiative to contact Gaddafi, or did he contact you? And he basically said, well, I mean, I think maybe perhaps I'll have to check on that. So his memory was pretty vague on the situation. He said that he was pretty sure that it was his decision, but don't really know, and he'd have to check. In general, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee asked no hard questions. They certainly didn't ask anything about rendition. They spent quite a bit of time that could have been used asking productive questions, asking about what Tony Blair thought about David Cameron's decisions post 2011, and didn't really spend all the time that they could asking about Tony Blair's decisions and his activities with Gaddafi. So he basically got off very, very lightly, although I have to say it's pretty clear on a couple of occasions that perhaps Tony Blair is starting to feel the pressure a little bit.
Yeah, there was a lot of stumbling there, Mike. And the other thing I think is interesting, he is beginning to look skeletal, if that's the right description. There's some of the cockiness has dropped off, and of course every time he's questioned, something else comes out on this one. I don't know whether you saw any of this, David, or you've
I didn't
comment on the illustrious
I was
Blair.
watching my own indigenous lying politician, although Tony Blair, don't tell anyone, is actually Scottish, and we try not to let on. So I didn't catch any of that. But yes, there is a distinct lack of certainty and a kind of it looks in many ways lost, because he can't walk down the street, can he? I mean, I remember once the last white leader of Rhodesia said of Mugabe, Ian Smith, he said, if Mugabe and I went out for an evening walking through the back streets of Harare, only one of us would come back alive, and it wouldn't be him. So Tony's kind of in that position where he's in a position where his standing in the country is now so low. It probably reflects in terms of safety. It certainly reflects in terms of freedom to move about and speak and get the sort of applause that he's maybe used to. All of that's gone.
All of that's gone. Donald Trump, you were keen to speak on the outburst of the Trump.
I found it really quite fascinating, the outburst from Donald Trump and the reaction. Several aspects to this. Yes, firstly, this paper up here. This is the first real analysis as to what Trump is all about, and it's by a libertarian writer called Jeffrey Tucker, who writes a great deal, and essentially that's what he does for a living. And he writes in terms on subjects of freedom and the free market and wanting to be away from government and having their oppressive hands off us. So he's not, shall we say, a natural ally of Donald Trump. Now, there was a festival called Freedom Fest held in America with lots of libertarian thinkers and talks and things, sort of a weekend type festival. And they invited every Republican Party candidate to come, and only two turned up. I take it one was Rand Paul, who's a sort of natural pro-libertarian member of the Republican Party, and the other one was Donald Trump, who turned up. So here you had this very libertarian audience being able to take in what Donald Trump was all about. And Jeffrey Tucker wrote a piece about it. Now, this got picked up in the international news as sort of Spectator, that type of international magazine, and it went round the world and got a lot of reprint in some major magazines, and a lot of retweeting and posting on the internet. What then happened was Jeffrey Tucker spent the next 2 weeks deleting abuse from his various Twitter feeds and social media outlets. He tapped into this enormous cesspit of very hard right-wing, neo-Nazi, racist, extreme nationalist strand of thought in America that he didn't know existed. He's American, he's lived all his life in America. He'd never come on this. He didn't know it was there. And what he found was there'd be a little group and they might have 30 or 40 followers, and they were all tweeting at him. And then in the next town or two towns over, there'll be another little group. So you've got all these small organizations, and they are being attracted to Trump by his rhetoric. He doesn't have to be as extreme as them, but he lets them know by what he does say that he's viewing the world their way.
David, if I can just interject there, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire has got an opinion on this, which Mike, you spotted.
Well, I mean, what Patrick's it's one of typical Patrick's assessments of the situation. It's very in depth and so on, and well analysed. But what he's basically asking is Donald Trump there as a stooge to help Hillary, and he's suggesting that the Republican sort of central organization is pretty upset about Trump and the effect that he's having on their sort of presidential race, the effect that he's having on the mainstream Republican presidential candidates. And he's asking perhaps come next June when they have their convention that he may be excluded in the same way that Ron Paul was excluded the last time round. And that perhaps that might cause even more factionalism and chaos. And really, he's asking the question, is Donald Trump there to make sure that the Republican Party can put up no effective opposition to Hillary? And that's really the point he's making.
There's also the risk from the Republican Party's point of view that if he doesn't get the nomination, he can afford to run as a third-party candidate, as an independent.
Which indeed he's tweeting out that kind of language.
Yeah. And pull enough votes away from the Republican base to make any Republican candidate a dead duck. Yes. The other aspect of this that I found interesting was the British reaction. Now, it's been one of, oh, this is terrible, you can't say that, it's absolutely appalling, which it is. But I think this gives another indication. If you look at what we are being asked to believe. Now, here in the UK column, we don't believe any of this. We don't buy any of what they're selling. But David Cameron and the leaders on both sides of the Atlantic claim to buy this. Obama claims that this is true. The claim is that radical Islam is a serious, immediate, and existential threat to the very survival of Great Britain and the United States of America. And it is serious, it's immediate, it's now, we should be afraid. If that's true, what Trump said would be reasonable. The fact that what Trump said has been trashed at the very highest levels of government in both Britain and America shows one thing, if it shows nothing else, that these people don't believe what they're actually selling. They don't believe it's a threat. They don't believe it's existential. They know it's nonsense. And they're not buying it. And we shouldn't either.
Okay. Well, is the United Nations going to save us?
No, but yesterday, we had intended to cover this yesterday, but ran out of time. Yesterday was International Human Rights Day. And the evening before this, the United Nations held their Human Rights Up Front convention, and it had various people speaking at it, a plenary, and they were discussing human rights with respect to genocide, as for example Rwanda and so on, and whether and when people should get involved in other people's disputes. And I just wanted to highlight a comment from Matthew Rycroft, who's the UK permanent representative to the United Nations when he was speaking at the plenary. And he was saying that sovereignty is not absolute. We live in an interconnected world. And this is really for comment from David, because the question that I asked you earlier, David, is when is sovereignty not absolute?
Well, this is a very big question for the news show. But one thing I would point out is from what does sovereignty derive its authority? In England, you've got this idea that Parliament's sovereign. Very dangerous. We don't have that in Scotland. We've got the idea that the people are sovereign. But that's a dangerous concept, because the people do not act as a single amorphous blob. They're not the Borg, however much certain political leaders would like us to be. And the freedom-loving aspect of the British tradition as to how these things are viewed is that the sovereignty is derived from personal sovereignty. You pool your sovereignty willingly in some sort of voluntary method. That's at least in theory. So you are sovereign, and any sovereignty that any government or parliament or group of people of any size has, it only has because that sovereignty is delegated from the individual to the group for things like communal defence. Now, that's a million miles away from what these people are saying. These people are saying, well, no, we are sovereign, we the parliament, we the crown, we the whatever are sovereign, and other countries are less so, and we can step in under certain circumstances. And once really you have that approach, there's almost nothing that can't be done.
Well, David, I'm sorry to just cut in there slightly. What better example than what they can do than to come back onto the Scottish named person scheme? And you've picked up that there's been a revised draft to the guidelines, which we got up on screen now. I know you're going to talk us through a couple of the bits, but this was some of the stuff. This paragraph I was particularly interested in because it says the named person is an entitlement for children and young people. However, parents and children are under no obligation under Part 4 of the Act to contact the named person or accept any help or support. That to me seems to be a bit of a turnaround, but we'll see what you've got to say. We've also got under well-being and welfare. Well, they tell you there's a difference between the two. Welfare as it relates to children and young people is a term open to interpretation, but is often used in the context of identifying a need for compulsory intervention under the 2011 Act. In terms of Scottish Government policy on children and families, welfare and well-being are different in that well-being is a broader, more holistic concept. There's a bit of waffle creeping in on that one. And this one down here, the use of compulsion at an early stage may help to ensure compliance with interventions and prevent well-being needs escalating. Very mixed language, but
yes,
the first one seems...
You spotted the inherent contradiction. You're under no obligation in Scotland to have anything to do with the named person. You're entirely free to reject their advice and their proffered help. However, they will then use compulsion. They will then take low-level well-being concerns, conflate it with welfare, which is a legal meaning which takes them into child welfare. And another quote here, it says here in 2.3.6 of that document, indeed, a series of low-level indicators of well-being need, whether obviously related or not, taken together, can amount to a child protection issue. So, when they say, as Aileen Campbell was prompted on radio, you heard the whisper off in the distance, child protection. When they say the only time we'll introduce compulsion is when it's a child protection issue, what they're not saying is, but a couple of low-level well-being concerns, and well-being concerns can be everything. Is your child too fat? Are you not taking them to church? Are you taking them to church too often? Are you Muslim? Well, we might not like that this week. Are you whatever? Whatever is being frowned upon by society. Do you not vaccinate? Do you not have enough interaction with the school? Are you a homeschooler? All these things can be viewed as suspicious. Yeah. We take a few of those boxes, that will be conflated through well-being into a welfare child protection concern, and then we're using coercion. And then that statement about you not having to interact and not having to take advice, well, that actually comes back to bite you, because that now becomes a further cause for concern, a further risk indicator. So it's extremely weaselly language, but it's quite clear who's in charge here. The state is in charge of our families in every way, shape or form it wants to be. And it will only be limited by the lack of resources.
David, the same state that at the moment can't protect the weak and very vulnerable within the NHS system. You were keen on this C.S. Lewis quote. I've an eye on the clock, so very quickly, whatever you'd like to say about this gentleman.
Rather summed it up well. He said, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under the omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They are more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will, cured of states which we may not regard as disease, is to put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. That is how families are being viewed in Scotland by the Scottish Government and the Scottish State.
Right. And I'll just reinforce that comment by an email that came into the UK column. It said, so it's from a gentleman called Mike. He said his son had special assembly at school today, came home saying it's government policy for schools to inform them, children, about the Syria conflict. Couldn't get much detail of him, so it's just a heads up. So here we are, the British government getting into schools and into the heads of our young people. And it's not up to parents to ensure that the children know and understand what's going on, what's dangerous, what they should be aware of. It's down to the government. And we're talking really constitutional issues and human rights, Mike.
Today the Constitutional Convention Bill reaches committee stage at the House of Lords. This is a private member's bill introduced by the Scottish peer, Lord Purvis of Tweed. There he is. He's a Scottish Liberal Democrat politician, was MSP for Tweeddale until 2011. Right. So the bill was launched in June this year. Purvis said that he wanted to end the current make, do and mend approach to constitutional reform, which he says is going to threaten the UK. He said he intends to provide a sustainable, balanced devolution settlement that works for the whole UK. And he said it was time to grasp the nettle and tackle reform. And so he's saying that the date has to be set for a constitutional convention by the 31st of December next year. And the convention should be composed of representatives of registered political parties, local authorities, the nations and regions, and that at least 50% of members of the convention must not be employed in a role which can reasonably be considered to be political. But nonetheless, the constitutional reform agenda in this country moves on apace, and that's that.
Another Scot, I would say, Mike. We'll just move on through this because we're going to cover in some detail cracks in the Forth Road Bridge.
Right, so, so we'll move on to Russia then. So Rome is refuting reports, according to this TASS article here, that it had asked for EU ministers to drop the idea of anti-Russian sanctions. And this had been reported on Wednesday, I believe, this week, that Italy had basically said that, or they'd put it on the agenda for the next EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, which is going to be held on the 14th of December. But they're saying, well, it's all a bit vague, actually. Have they done this or have they not? They've said we cannot confirm that Italy has done this. They said that Italy has always held the position that sanctions against Russia are not irreversible. So it's still a bit vague. But in the meantime, in France, there seems to be moves to do exactly this, at least as far as France is concerned. So this is a French MP, Thierry Mariani, and he has put a draft legislation in to abolish the sanctions against Russia. He said the next step will be to collect as many signatures among members of Parliament under this resolution. My target is 150 signatures. After collecting them, I plan in January to present it for debate to the National Assembly. I'd like to see France lift sanctions against Russia. It's proposed to the French government to acknowledge the cancellation of economic sanctions and limited measures imposed by the European Union on the Russian Federation and begin a review of the sanctions policy in regard to Russia. So maybe we start to see some Europeans within Europe really recognizing the ridiculousness of these sanctions. But in the meantime, this we mentioned yesterday, this story that Putin had hoped that nuclear warheads would not be. Actually, I mean, this headline in the Independent here absolutely misrepresenting what Putin actually said. So let's just remind ourselves what he said. He said, naturally, it's not necessary to use nuclear weapons when fighting terrorists, and I hope they will never be needed. So it was never a suggestion that he would hope that nuclear warheads would never be needed against ISIS. Basically, what he was suggesting was that they would never be needed against anybody. So he made it quite clear that ISIS would never be the subject of these types of weapons. But in the meantime, he is being absolutely clear about his position with regard to any further military action against any Russian activity in Syria. So he said this morning, any targets threatening our military or land infrastructure must be immediately destroyed. So he's stepping up the rhetoric. And Turkey, in complete arrogance, also stepping up the rhetoric, because they're basically saying to Putin, just keep calm. Our patience is not unlimited. And, what is Turkey up to here? They're clearly intending to incite bad relations with Russia in the hope of bringing NATO into something much bigger.
Well, we can rest assured, Mike, of course, that GCHQ are keeping an eye on that if they're not too busy in checking what's in our shopping basket. Let's just bring in our advert. A lot of people very keen to get their own opinions out as to what's happening around us. UK Columns giving somebody an opportunity by winning this microphone and stand and the associated software by sending us a podcast on whatever subject. And our offer ends on the 1st of January 2016. Does not include the computer. But can I just say to people who perhaps spend quite a bit of time criticising, here's your opportunity to be able to speak out yourselves, and UK Column is giving you the opportunity to do that. Well, public cuts, there isn't money. That's the great lie of or isn't enough money, the great lie of the British government. Could all be solved overnight with reinstatement of the Bradbury pound, the issuance of credit on the value and wealth of the nation. And we are told there's no money. Cutbacks are putting safety at risk. And what better place to go than the Forth Road Bridge? Let's just go through this a little bit, and I'll hand over to David, who of course totally qualified as an engineer himself. But here's the headline: SNP Minister admits cancelled repairs included the Forth Road Bridge fault. Now we're just going to come back and say, why is safety important on suspension bridges? And the standard is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which, due to a variety of design faults and structural faults, collapsed in high winds after going into violent oscillation. And this is a video which, if you're interested, go and watch. So we've just taken a still in which you can see the grossly deformed bridge, which has been caused by the high winds. Well, luckily the Forth Road Bridge hasn't succumbed to that sort of stuff. But basically, we get a decision to close the southbound carriageway as a safety precaution after one of the engineers spotted a defect in a piece of steelwork. That led to quite an adventure by tweet. Here's the Forth Road Bridge company tweeting out saying, unfortunately, steelwork repairs require a full closure. So it's gone from partial to full. 1 point only emergency vehicles were allowed across. What was the cause of all this? Well, if we just take you into, here's a picture which Alex has kindly spotted. Here's the crack, which is causing the problem. Where is that crack on the bridge? Well, if we join the two together in the diagram, it's close to one of the pillars. And before I hand over to David, let's just show you here some of the team on that section of the bridge, quite high up, as you can see, brave chaps. Here's the crack in this bit here, and here's a guy even closer to the crack, which you can now see. David, they've stopped the repairs, they stopped the maintenance work effectively, this is putting public lives at risk.
Well, it's certainly putting the infrastructure at risk, and it's putting an important link at risk. The reason I included the Tacoma Narrows picture there is that the Forth Bridge was the first major suspension bridge built anywhere in the world after the failure of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Tacoma Narrows fell down due to a twisting oscillation, a vortice shedding. The way that the wind hit the deck caused it to twist in a way that eventually destroyed it. And it wasn't a particularly strong wind. It was only about 40 miles an hour. So it was quite a modest wind, really, that caused that particular failure. So there was a major design development to provide a very deep stiffening truss to the Forth Bridge to make sure nothing similar would happen. So where that stiffening truss meets the main tower is where this failure has occurred. Now, it's not really a safety issue in this particular case because you've got the main load transfer system is via hangers up to the main cables. So to give you some sort of idea of the scale of it, the sort of load going through this connection is something in the order of 100 tons, whereas the sort of load that's going into the top of a main tower is of the order of 10,000 tons. So it's a very small amount of the total load, but it's still an important component of the bridge. If this component and its neighbouring one fails, under full loading, the bridge deck drops about 3/4 of a metre, so you get a lot of movement. And if this defect was allowed to exist, it would throw up other defects in adjoining components and similar links. And there's eight sets of these links on the whole bridge. So it had to be closed to be repaired, and this all came about very quickly. And then what started to come out very quickly, thanks to social media, people were starting to research this, and they found that wait a minute, this defect was in fact identified back in 2010 or before. Actually, it goes back to about 2006. But by 2010, there was a tender going out to get an engineer to design the detail of the repair works. And then that tender was cancelled. And we then find that what happened, that tender was cancelled in 2011. What else happened in 2011? It was cancelled just into the new financial year in 2011. And there was a 65% cut to the budget for maintenance from the Scottish Government that year. So that's why it was cut. And then we started to see the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland running for cover.
I can just bring that one up on screen here. This is a tweet from Audit Scotland commenting on that. There it is in blue, the 65% reduction there. So the money issue is critical.
Yes, so they've cut back the budget, and they've obviously taken a risk that this overstress, which was identified, was going to manifest itself in some unfortunate way. And that risk has proved to be unwise, and it has indeed manifested itself in its closed bridge. Now, the Forth Bridge in Scottish transport terms is absolutely vital. It's a very long detour if you're going north from between the cities of Edinburgh up to Dundee. It's a very long detour over roads not designed for the volume of traffic. People are spending an extra hour or 2 hours to get to work between one side of the river and the other. So there's a huge amount of disruption. The Scottish road haulage industry reckons it's costing them £600,000 a day in the cost of the disruption for losing this bridge. So it's very, very major. Now, there's a new bridge under construction at the moment. That won't be ready for another year or so. And we are at the moment without this vital piece of infrastructure. So it's not a safety concern, but it is certainly a major link in our transport system that's gone, and it's gone clearly with the sticky fingerprints of our wise overlords being penny wise and pound foolish all over the situation.
Okay. Well, we've got a quick shot here of Public Contracts Scotland. This is part of a cancelled tender for repair work on this particular component. Is that right?
Yes. So this is the tender. It was put out in the start of 2010. It was cancelled in 2011, and it announces that the end link hanger of the truss has been, which is the component we're talking about, the area that's failed, has been analysed and found to be overstressed under certain loading conditions and requires strengthening. So that announced to the world in 2010 there was a potential defect here. There was a latent defect. There was an overstress. And what overstress will tend to do is will generate fatigue, cracks, and failure. So they knew the problem was there in 2010. This got tweeted out. This is a story of lying. It's a story of how governments lie and how they twist and try to spin the truth. The government said, well, it wasn't the area that repair, that 2010 repair, that tender invitation, didn't refer to the area that failed, to the component that failed. They choose the words in a lawyer type way, where they're trying to be technically accurate but mislead the country. You know, as in Bill Clinton, I did not have sexual intercourse with that woman. Right? You know, as he defined the words at that point, he was telling the truth, but in fact he was clearly out to deceive. And we've had an example of that here. The overstress wasn't in the component that failed, but it was in the assembly that failed. It was at the other end of that bar. Right? So the works that were cancelled in 2010 would have prevented this from happening, would have involved replacing the affected component. So this would not have happened had those works gone ahead. And that was denied in Parliament by the minister, who then went on radio the next day and was questioned about it again and had to admit that actually, yes, it would have in fact involved replacing the component that failed. So there's lots of spin and weasel words and the attempt to deceive the public, to obscure the fact that what's actually happened is the budget was cut by 65%. The maintenance that was in train at that point was slowed down. And before it was done, in this particular case, a fatigue crack is generated to such a point that it's propagated right the way through the element. And we've had a complete rupture of this particular hanger. And we have a safety concern or a technical concern that cannot be ignored, and we're required to shut the bridge at no notice.
Well, David, thank you for a very detailed analysis there. Of course, the underlying good news is that, as you say, the attention of the public to detail, people researching material which is in the public domain, albeit sometimes hidden a little bit, has produced quite an amazing backlash. We'll just end with this Sunday Post report here, which says, why wasn't this fixed 5 years ago? So people power, getting things which aren't right exposed can be done. And when people are doing professional type research from their own homes and working together in a sensible way, we can really achieve some good results. Of course, we need this.
If I can just end on a final quote here. The government spent 2 or 3 days saying that it definitely wasn't anything to do with budget constraints. And then someone's come up with a set of minutes that read, in addition, this is minutes from the organisation that was then maintaining the bridge. As reported previously by the Chief Engineer and Bridge Master, a number of significant non-committed schemes have been deferred to post 2015-2016 due to budgetary constraints. Deferring these projects may lead to an increase in the overall cost. However, these costs will be met post-abolition of that particular organisation by the Scottish Government. The projects deferred were, and there's a list, and the list includes full replacement of the truss end links, and that's what failed. So there's no doubt about it. It was absolutely and definitely cancelled due to budgetary constraints, and the item that failed would have been replaced before now.
Okay, thank you very much for that, David. We'll just leave our viewers today with an image of the good news about the Forth Road Bridge, and that is it's pretty flexible. So we've got 2 images here. The top one, there's no loading, so you can see a continuous curve to that piece of carriageway on the bridge. When 518 tonnes of load comes on it, that section has flattened out. So while you're travelling, the bridge is gently going up and down, and it does that to keep you safe. It's much the same as the wings of an aeroplane, although many people choose to forget that fact. David, thanks very much for joining us. As always, we're getting to the bottom of the fact that the general public is being told a pack of lies over a number of subjects. Care in the NHS, critically important, terrorism, critically important, and of course the grand lie behind it all, which is that we're in great debt to bankers who, of course, make the money out of nothing. Thanks very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Monday, getting even closer to Christmas. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.